contempt.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kavala Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific, but a little bit sad too, because one of my very, very good friends in Tanzania, Reginald Mengi, died.
Okay, we'll get that in a moment. Let's welcome all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask him some pertinent questions about politics and what's really going on the continent. Since you mentioned the passing of our dear friend, a great journalist, a media mogul in Tanzania, let's start with that. He recently passed away. Maybe your thoughts, Shaka.
An incredible man, Reginald Mengi, to be very honest with you. He was remarkably generous, especially when it came to being there, really, for the needy. This is a man who was one of the few multi-billionaires in Tanzania, in dollar terms, by the way. But a man who came from very humble beginnings and, frankly, never forgot where he came from. He lived a very lavish life. But I think that he perhaps will be best remembered for having been a pioneer when media liberalism came across Africa. He was one of those few individuals who pioneered and championed very fiercely the independent media in Tanzania. You're talking about television, you're talking about radio, you're talking about newspapers. It was Reginald Mengi.
The media landscape in Tanzania seems to be dominated by people who come from very humble beginnings. You just talked about Mengi. We have another guy, a friend of ours called Eric Shigongo. They all seem to come from these very, very humble beginnings, but somehow they make it and they're able to change the media landscape in Tanzania. They've been able to make the changes in Tanzania as far as the media is concerned.
They are probably people that worked very, very hard and focused very, very, in a manner that they wouldn't leave anything to chance. Very disciplined, very visionary, and to be very honest with you, when you talk about Mengi, I can only tell you that I agree with some who say that perhaps Reginald Mengi was a president that Tanzania never had and never will have.
How can, a lot of people have been, of course, talking about his passing, but his media empire, can it live long beyond here after he's left us? A lot of people were talking about maybe it could be taken over by other interested parties.
Well, I think that I would leave that speculation for some other day, but what I know is that it is a very, very organized operation, and I think that there is one of his daughters who is running it, and she is very respected. She's someone that is very professional, that knows precisely what she's doing. So I think that time will tell whether or not the daughter, the family, and some other professionals will carry out his mission. But what I can say is that this was not an ordinary Tanzanian. This was a Tanzanian that was very, very highly and largely respected. As a matter of fact, it can even be seen in the manner in which his body, when it landed in the Tanzanian commercial and economic capital, Dar es Salaam, yesterday from Dubai. I was talking to a friend of mine, Premi Kibanga, who used to be then President Jakaya Kikwete's press secretary, and she told me that Dar es Salaam is in mourning. Dar es Salaam, by the way, in terms of its meaning, it is supposed to be the harbor of peace. And right now, it is apparently in mourning. And rightly so, because again, like I said, this was a man that was remarkably generous. A man who really was a force for good. He used his wealth not in a manner that is very selfish. He was always there for others, those that were less fortunate. You know, he reminds me of another multi-billionaire in Africa who also is somebody that people said he was the president that Nigeria never had. You know him, of course, the late Mashoud Abiola, the man that arguably won an election back in 1993. And General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida annulled it. And hence, of course, the emergence of General Sani Abacha, who pretty much came close to destroying Nigeria as we know it today.
Shaka, let's move on. I will maybe pay a special tribute to the greater guy in Tanzania tomorrow on the edition of Straight Talk.
I would like to say before, if you could allow me, that before we go really, that I would like to express my profound, heartfelt condolences to the family of Reggie Mengi and the people of Tanzania and indeed the people of Africa for the passing of Reginald Mengi.
Okay.
May his soul rest in eternal peace.
Thank you, Shaka. Let's move along. Let's talk about the upcoming elections. South Africans are heading to the ballot box tomorrow. There is a lot at stake. Maybe bring us up to speed. What are the expectations? Could we see change happening in South Africa? What's cooking in, as far as the political landscape is concerned?
The good thing, perhaps just like football is referred to, especially the World Cup, as the beautiful game. The beautiful thing about elections in South Africa is that they are indeed elections. They are not selections. They are not the type of elections whose results reflect, for example, the will of the individual who announces the results, or whose results reflect the will of the people who count the vote. But in fact, the results of an election in South Africa accurately reflects the will of the people who actually went to vote.
The ANC is celebrating 25 years of being at the helm of South Africa. Right after apartheid, the apartheid system was defeated in 1994. They have been pretty much leading South Africa. But there are a lot of critics who say that the ANC has failed its people. Black unemployment is at the highest in that country. You cannot compare. I was looking at a poll where they were putting it over almost 60% unemployment rate among black people. So what is there to celebrate as the ANC has been at the helm of South African politics?
Well, mind you, you have to give credit to, or at least some credit to the ANC, because the African National Congress happens to be the oldest political party on the African continent. It came into being around 1912, if I remember correctly. And along the way, it has been able to take credit, obviously, for having succeeded in making sure that apartheid is no more. It is a party that is embraced largely by the indigenous African people who happen to form the majority in terms of population in South Africa. But of course, it has also had a little bit of political bleeding. The Democratic Alliance, which is a party that pretty much reflects those people who ran apartheid, even though at the moment we talk, it has an indigenous African, black African leader. It controls some of the major, if not the most major, urban centers including Johannesburg to boot. But you have also an emerging party, which is called the Economic Freedom Fighters Party of a one Julius Malema, a man, by the way, who at one time used to be the president of the ANC Youth League. And former presidents of ANC Youth League have actually gone on to become presidents of the Republic of South Africa. But in this particular case, he has this new emerging party. It has not a lot of following. It probably is in the neighborhood, probably something less than 20%. But it has, what I would say, probably in terms of the cards, if you're a good card player, it has a jack, in the sense that it has this policy regarding the land, who owns the land in South Africa. As a matter of fact, he's the kind of guy who influenced the ANC to embrace a policy that in fact is in place right now. They talk about having a policy which is designed, for example, to remove the land from the minority white commercial farmers to the majority of the population in South Africa, and they want to remove that land with no compensation, which is something rather controversial, especially given that when you look towards the north, when you cross the Limpopo, and you are in a country called Zimbabwe that used to be Rhodesia and what have you, you know what happened about the land reform issues there. You and I were in Zimbabwe last year in July, August, and all that kind of stuff, and you can still see the land reform policy, what it really did to Zimbabwe.
How about critics who say that maybe perhaps this is just a rhetoric? Mr. Malema just uses that to really to appeal to the disenfranchised people, the unemployed young people, people who are looking forward maybe to owning a piece of land. But in reality, his policies, especially his particular policy on this land reform, might never see light at the end of the day. How do you react to that kind of stuff?
You know, Paul, it is very interesting that one of the key definitions of politics, we've talked about that before, is that politics is the art of all possibilities. Politics allows individuals, for example, when they are running for office, to pretty much promise anything they can think about. As a matter of fact, someone once said that when politicians are running for office, and this is not limited to South Africa, or Africa for that matter, this is global, that when the politicians are running for office, they do it in poetry, meaning they are very flowery, meaning they sometimes promise stuff that they can't possibly deliver. They promise, for example, heaven on earth. And yet, when they are actually elected and they come into office and it comes to the business of governing, that one, they say, is actually done in prose. They become realistic because they deal with the reality on the ground, the socio-economic, political realities. And so we need to be a little bit patient. If Julius Malema at some point becomes the man, the new kid on the block, we'll have to wait and see. But when you think about his rhetoric, and you think about his energy, and you think about the economic political reality on the ground, and the fact that in terms of ideology, he is a little bit even more left of center than in fact the ruling ANC and what have you, anything is possible.
How about, before we go to the comments, let's talk about this other party, the Democratic Alliance, actually, which is technically the main opposition in South Africa. A lot of people, over the years, they have seen it grow, and it has had some gains across the board. There are a lot of people who think that for the first time, ANC could actually put a face a threat at the ballot box, because the DNC, rather the DA, the Democratic Alliance, and the EFF parties have sort of like gone after the ANC seriously in terms of corruption. They have failed to curtail the corruption. It's so rampant. There are corruption scandals everywhere. So these guys are taking them on.
Yes, they are taking them on, but I think that the Democratic Alliance can count obviously on the white South African, can count on some Asian South African, and probably very few urbanized indigenous Africans.
So it's inclusive. It's one of those inclusive parties.
It is inclusive, but it is not anywhere near a situation where it could actually even dream and hope of getting a majority. If in fact it is doing very, very well, it probably will be in the neighborhood of 20% of the vote. And it's quite possible that it could in fact consolidate its hold on major urban centers like Johannesburg, the city of gold, like Cape Town, Pretoria, and what have you, and stuff like that, and probably Durban. But for the most part, I think that the ANC is still very, very safe in terms of winning an election. It will simply probably, be losing some percentages and all that kind of stuff.
A free and fair election or
yes.
a selection?
No, an election, a free and fair election. Mind you, the ANC's, basically really main base is the rural areas of South Africa.
But Malema is already,
That's where the majority of South Africans live. And my friend, yes, James, Julius Malema, his message is good for some of those people, but not sufficient to make the man come on top.
Let's go to some comments. Let's start with Okeke. Should governments teach people what freedom means, or is it up to the people to call for freedom? In the particular context of South Africa, we are looking at a country that was for so long under the apartheid system. It's only now that some people are experiencing what you call freedom. And not only that, but there are also critics who say that the ANC itself has failed its people. The people who fought for that freedom have been let down by the same government that we're talking about.
It is very interesting when you talk about freedom, because perhaps freedom means different things to different people. But there can also be a case that can also be honestly made that you cannot really be free or feel free on an empty stomach. There is no question, though, as former US President Barack Obama once said, that even with prosperity, without freedoms, it is a form of fundamental poverty. You need to be free. You need to be in a situation where you feel comfortable, in the sense that you can actually be part of the decision-making policies or programs that affect you and all the other South Africans or Africans or people for that matter. I think that when you think about how does freedom come about, I think the government has a fundamental responsibility. Especially this should be reflected in the educational curriculum. In other words, young people should grow up in schools being socialized in a way that they know what their political rights are, for example, that they are citizens, they have responsibilities and opportunities, that they are actually the primary stakeholders of their society. So the government should definitely, any government worth its salt really, it should be in a position where it introduces and provides civic education so that people can understand what their role is in society. And if they don't, civil society should be able to step in and do the needful. When it comes to power, though, power is not something, frankly, that you can expect to come or fall as manna from heaven. The Bible talks about manna from heaven. But in reality, power is something that has to be demanded. And you can demand it on the basis, for example, of mobilization and organization within the context of the, essentially, the blue document, the constitution that you have. And South Africa has those types of opportunities because it is a country, at least since it regained its political independence in 1994, it has actually recalled two presidents, two incumbent presidents, beginning with Thabo Mbeki, and later, of course, the man who succeeded him, Mushorozi, Jacob Zuma. And it depends, of course, on how Ramaphosa behaves, Cyril Ramaphosa. But Ramaphosa is the kind of gentleman that probably, if elected, will probably end up completing 2 terms.
Very quickly, how do you react to this comment here from Nambilirwa, Mona Amina? She says the ANC is predicated on false premises. They talk about bringing jobs, they haven't done that. They talk about corruption, they have failed to fight corruption. Earlier he talked about President Jacob Zuma. He has scandals of corruption, wrapped around his head. You can talk about so many other things, xenophobic attacks, they have failed to contain that. How do you respond?
You know, when you talk about democracy, democracy is a work in progress. I think that it is true that the ANC has delivered some things, and it is also equally true that it has not been perfect. It has a very long way to go. It still has to deliver more to the people of South Africa. But I think that under the leadership of Cyril Ramaphosa, there is an attempt in terms of fighting corruption and graft and what have you. Let's see what happens after these elections. If the ANC retains power, which it is likely to do, depending on what percentage, if it is also has adequate numbers in parliament so that it can pass through the kind of policies that are needed and required to empower the people of South Africa. I think that when we look at the political reality, like I said earlier, the ANC is still going to be in power for quite some time.
Very briefly, let's go to Nzama. Do you see Ramaphosa doing 2 terms in South Africa?
I don't see any reason why he wouldn't, because the last time I checked, the public opinion polls, if they are to be believed, they look reasonable in the sense that the ANC is, at the end of the day, going to actually win the election. And mind you, in South Africa has a democracy that is a sort of like a tradition of what you would call a parliamentary system. And of course, when you throw in the presidency, it sort of becomes a hybrid of sorts. The president of South Africa, or the individual who becomes president of South Africa, unlike a lot of presidential systems, the presidential system democracies elsewhere on the continent and the world, you do not need to run for president as an individual. It is the political party that gains the majority, or the coalition of political parties, that actually choose who will be the president of South Africa. And in that particular case, I sincerely do not see any reason why Cyril Ramaphosa will not be able to renew his political lease in Pretoria.
Okay, let's do a quick follow-up from Hello Nzama. Talking as a South African, apartheid never ended. The white people still think they are superior because they have more jobs than black people.
Well, not only do they have more jobs than probably black people, and the reason they do perhaps is because they have actually the skill sets that are especially required in a modern economy. They also, as we said earlier, they own the vast majority of the arable land in South Africa, and so they have the opportunity of becoming very prosperous, rich farmers, and therefore they can actually provide jobs to their kith and kin. I think that the future of the indigenous South Africans lies in education and acquiring new skill sets.
Let's close over to Uganda. Let's do two comments from Uganda. Let's start with Eric Ochen. Is the political wave in Uganda signaling positively to regime change or worsening the situation? And another quick follow-up, Shaka, I wish to hear you give us a side. If Ugandan opposition parties can change Ugandan democracy, from Ronald in Rwanda.
Eric, first of all, let's face it, society, just like Uganda, is not static. It is dynamic. And so anybody who actually thinks that he can stop change, the changes that must occur, is either dreaming really or probably engaged in what someone would call wishful thinking. And in fact, here I can say clearly that I would, if I had the opportunity to do it, I would, for example, appeal to the Ugandan political authorities, in particular the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, to be realistic. He is a student of history. He knows what has been happening in Uganda. He knows what he fought against. I don't think that it would be good or a good thing for him and for anybody to end up being like the specific individual leaders that he was so contemptuous of, leaders that he said were what Nigerians would call sit-tight presidents, meaning someone that transforms himself into a presidential monarch. You have had enough time to do your thing. You have had great opportunities. Ugandans have given you great opportunities to be the best president that you could be. The question is, can you possibly find it in your beautiful Rwashtura heart and soul and manage your exit properly so that you do not at least give an opportunity to someone else? You deny someone else or some other groups and forces the opportunity to essentially manage your exit. You can look north, you look at Khartoum. You know a man called, Omar Bashir. You don't want to be in that kind of situation. You have made some good contributions to society. You have also equally made some bad contributions to society. I think it is time for you to manage your exit so that you can live honorably and help at least to contribute towards the possibility of Uganda remaining peaceful and stable.
Very briefly, let's go to Lawrence Mberela in Malawi. We are having elections this month. How can you put my trust and vote for my fellow youth?
Well, I think that, first of all, when we talk about elections, whether they're in Malawi or anywhere else, this is a personal thing. This is something that should be private, really. You should make an informed decision based on the kind of information you have as to who you think is the best person for the job.
Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Well, you know that we are going to talk about, of course, the upcoming election. Not upcoming, as a matter of fact. South African election is tomorrow. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about.
On that note, thank you so much. It's been a nice discussion here. So long from Washington.
Thank you.